The rain fell in relentless gray sheets, blurring the world outside the windows of the Starlight Diner into a watercolor wash of neon and asphalt. Inside, the air was warm, thick with the scent of frying bacon, old coffee, and the damp wool of coats. It was a pocket of sanctuary against the Tuesday afternoon deluge. For Arthur and his son, Leo, it was their sanctuary. Booth number 7, the one with the cracked red vinyl and a perfect view of the humming jukebox, was their weekly ritual, a small, fiercely protected island of normalcy in a life that often felt like a storm. Arthur watched his son's hands, the way they moved with a fluid grace that was a language all its own. Leo, all of 8 years old with a constellation of freckles across his nose and his mother's deep brown eyes, was signing with animated excitement about a squirrel he'd seen that morning, one that had bravely stolen a whole peanut from a blue jay. His fingers danced, creating shapes that spoke of daring, flight, and triumph. Arthur's own hands, calloused and scarred from a life of hard work and harder memories, answered back in the same silent dialect. His movements were slower, more deliberate, but filled with an equal measure of love. He signed he was a brave warrior squirrel. Leo beamed, a smile so pure it seemed to generate its own light in the diner's dim corner. In this small booth they were a world of two, a world built on a foundation of unspoken understanding that was deeper than any ocean. They didn't need sound. Their connection was a quiet, resonant chord that hummed between them, unheard but deeply felt. The clatter of cutlery, the low murmur of conversation from other patrons, the hiss of the grill, it was all just background noise to a symphony only they could appreciate. The bell above the door jangled violently, a discordant clang that sliced through the diner's gentle ambience. 3 men stomped in, shaking rain from their leather jackets like wet dogs. They brought the chill of the storm in with them, their laughter loud, coarse, and utterly devoid of joy. The man in the lead, Rick, had a face like a clenched fist and small, predatory eyes that swept the room with an air of entitled ownership. His 2 companions were pale imitations, shadows that moved in his wake, echoing his boorish chuckles. They slid into the booth directly across from Arthur and Leo, their movements aggressive, jostling the table and making the sugar dispenser rattle. The diner's gentle hum faltered. Conversations dipped. Patrons shifted uncomfortably, their gazes dropping to their plates. The waitress, a young woman named Chloe with tired eyes, approached their table with a practiced, weary smile. Rick dismissed her with a wave of his hand, his attention snagged by the silent conversation happening across the aisle. He watched Leo's hands, a sneer slowly twisting his lips. He nudged his friend. "Hey, look at that," he said, his voice a low growl that carried easily in the suddenly quiet room. "Little puppet show over here." His friend snickered, a wet, unpleasant sound. "What's he doing? Some kind of magic trick?" Rick leaned forward, propping his elbows on the sticky tabletop. He crudely mimicked Leo's signing, his thick fingers fumbling into grotesque, meaningless shapes. He wiggled them in the air, a cruel parody. "Ooh, spooky. Look at me. I'm casting a spell." Laughter erupted from their booth, sharp and ugly. Leo, who couldn't hear the words but could feel the vibrations of their laughter and see the malice in their eyes, faltered. His hands, once so expressive and free, dropped to his lap. He looked at his father, his brow furrowed with a confusion that was rapidly souring into fear. The light in his eyes dimmed. Arthur felt a familiar, cold weight settle in his gut. It was the weight of a world that was not built for his son, a world that too often met difference with cruelty. He put a reassuring hand on Leo's knee under the table, a small, firm pressure that said, "I'm here. You're safe." He did not look at the men. He kept his gaze fixed on his son, trying to rebuild their sanctuary with the force of his will alone. He signed slowly and clearly, "They are just being silly. Pay them no mind. Tell me more about the squirrel." But the spell was broken. The laughter from the other booth grew louder, feeding on the silence of the other patrons. Every eye in the diner was on them now, a collection of gazes filled with pity, fear, and a shared, shameful inaction. The Starlight Diner was no longer their sanctuary. It had become a stage, and they were the unwilling spectacle. The rain beat against the glass, a frantic, desperate rhythm, as if trying to warn them of the storm that had just moved inside. The warm, comforting scent of coffee was now tainted with the bitter smell of humiliation. Rick's amusement curdled into annoyance at Arthur's deliberate lack of reaction. A man like Rick needed a response. He fed on fear and anger, and this quiet man's stoicism was a denial of his power. He slid out of his booth and swaggered over to Arthur's table, his presence casting a large, oppressive shadow over them. His two friends followed, flanking him, creating a human cage around the small family. The air crackled with a new level of tension. The low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen seemed to have stopped, holding its breath along with everyone else. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Rick snarled, his voice dropping to a low, menacing pitch. He leaned down, his face uncomfortably close to Arthur's. The sour smell of stale cigarettes and cheap beer washed over him. "You got a problem? Your kid's making a scene. It's disturbing the other customers." The lie was blatant, absurd. The only disturbance was the one Rick and his cronies were creating. Arthur could feel the collective gaze of the other patrons, a heavy blanket of silent witness. He could see Chloe, the waitress, frozen behind the counter, her hand gripping a dish rag, her face pale with fear. He saw the diner's owner, Mr. Henderson, a man who had always greeted them with a kindly smile, now peeking out from the kitchen, his expression one of helpless anxiety. No one would intervene. They were on their own. Arthur slowly turned his head to meet Rick's gaze. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were calm, betraying none of the cold fury coiling in his stomach. He didn't speak. He simply held the man's stare, his silence a more profound and infuriating response than any shouted retort could ever be. He was a wall, an immovable object of paternal protection. His entire being was focused on a single, desperate objective, to absorb the ugliness of this moment so that as little of it as possible would touch his son. "What, you deaf too?" Rick mocked, a humorless smirk spreading across his face. He gestured dismissively at Leo, who had shrunk into the corner of the booth, trying to make himself small. "You can't control your kid? All that hand-flapping is weird. It's a freak show. People are trying to eat here." Leo understood the word freak. He'd seen it scrawled in a school bathroom once, had it whispered behind his back on the playground. It was a word that felt like a stone, heavy and sharp. He tugged on his father's sleeve, his eyes wide and pleading. He signed a single, frantic word. "Go." Arthur placed his hand over his son's, giving it a gentle squeeze. Soon he signed back, keeping his movements small and discreet. "Be brave." Rick saw the subtle exchange. "There you go again," he spat, his voice rising in volume. "This ain't the place for that. Take your little puppet and get out." He jabbed a thumb toward the door. Now, this was the moment Arthur had always dreaded, the confrontation he had spent years trying to navigate and avoid. It was the raw, unfiltered cruelty of the world crashing into the quiet, safe space he had so carefully constructed for his son. He could fight. A deep, dormant part of him, a part forged in the dust and fire of a land far from this rainy town, knew exactly how to dismantle a man like Rick. He knew the precise points of weakness, the exact amount of force required to turn this swaggering bully into a whimpering heap on the checkered linoleum floor. But to do so would be to lose. It would teach Leo that violence was the answer, that their response to ugliness should be an ugliness of their own. It would validate the bully's worldview, that everything could be solved with brute force. And so Arthur remained still. He absorbed the insults, the palpable threat, the denial of his and his son's basic right to exist in a public space. He let the words hit him like stones, and he did not flinch. His dignity was his shield, his love for his son his armor. He would not be broken, and he would not be baited. He simply looked at Rick, his expression unreadable, and gave a slow, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He would not leave. This was their place. They had as much right to be here as anyone. This quiet refusal was a greater act of defiance than any punch he could have thrown. It was a declaration that their worth was not negotiable. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with unspoken threats. Rick's face darkened, his jaw tightening. He had been denied the reaction he craved, his power nullified by a quiet man's resolve. The conflict had reached a tipping point, and the entire diner held its breath, waiting for it to break. Inside Arthur's mind, the world was anything but silent. It was a storm of memories, a torrent of grief and resolve that anchored him in the present moment. He saw his wife, Sarah, her face illuminated by the soft glow of a bedside lamp. He saw her hands, so much like Leo's, moving with effortless elegance as she taught him his first signs. Love, family, forever. She had been a teacher for the deaf, and her passion was not just a job. It was the very essence of her being. She believed that communication was a bridge, and she spent her life building them. When Leo was born, and they learned he shared her silent world, she had looked at Arthur not with sorrow, but with a fierce, radiant joy. "He will teach us a new way to listen," she had said. And he did. After Sarah was taken from them by a sickness that came as swift and merciless as a summer storm, that bridge of language became Arthur's lifeline. It was the last, most vibrant piece of her he had left. Every sign was a memory, every silent conversation a continuation of his vow to her. He had promised her, in the sterile quiet of a hospital room as her hands grew still in his, that he would always protect their boy. He would build him a world so full of love and acceptance that he would never feel the sting of his otherness, that his deafness would be a source of strength, not a deficiency. This diner, this weekly ritual of a shared plate of fries and a chocolate milkshake, was a small but vital brick in the foundation of that world. It was a piece of ordinary life, a claim on public space that declared they belonged. It was Sarah's favorite place, the spot where he had proposed to her, fumbling with the ring and the sign for "Marry Me" at the same time. Coming here was an act of remembrance, a way of keeping her spirit present in their lives. To be driven from this place would be more than a humiliation. It would be a desecration of that memory. His past whispered other lessons to him as well. He remembered the suffocating heat of the desert, the weight of his gear, the constant, thrumming anxiety of a world where a single misstep could be your last. He had served 2 tours. He had seen real conflict, real monsters. He had learned the hard way that the loudest men were often the weakest, their aggression a brittle mask for a deep-seated fear. He had learned that true strength was not in the attack, but in the ability to hold your position, to endure, to protect the person next to you when everything was falling apart. That training, that discipline now served a different purpose. It was not about surviving an ambush. It was about surviving the casual cruelty of a man like Rick. It was about holding the line for his son. So he held it. He absorbed the bully's venom, letting it wash over him without finding purchase. He was a rock in the stream, unmoving, his focus entirely on the small, trembling boy beside him. He could feel Leo's leg vibrating with fear against his own. He was 8 years old. He shouldn't have to face this. He should be thinking about warrior squirrels and the perfect ratio of chocolate syrup in a milkshake. This man, this insignificant tyrant in a cheap leather jacket, was stealing his son's childhood, one ugly word at a time. The cold fury inside Arthur coiled tighter, a sleeping serpent of controlled rage. But he would not let it strike. Not here. Not in front of his son. His promise to Sarah was stronger than his anger. His love for Leo was his anchor in this maelstrom of hate. He would endure. Frustration boiled over into rage. Rick, infuriated by Arthur's unshakable calm, needed to shatter it. Words were not enough. He needed a physical act, a definitive gesture of dominance that would break this quiet man's dignity and force a reaction. His eyes fell on the tray sitting on their table, holding a half-eaten basket of fries and a tall, frothy chocolate milkshake, Leo's favorite. With a guttural snarl, Rick swept his arm across the table. The tray flew through the air. The plastic basket of fries clattered against the floor, scattering golden potatoes across the dirty linoleum. The tall glass containing the milkshake followed a moment later, seeming to hang in the air for a horrifying eternity before it met the ground with a sickening, explosive crash. Brown liquid and shards of glass sprayed across the floor, some of it spattering onto Arthur's worn work boots. The sound was a gunshot in the tomb-like silence of the diner. It was a definitive, violent punctuation mark to the escalating tension. Every person in the room flinched. Leo let out a small, sharp cry, a sound he couldn't hear but could feel tearing from his own throat. He buried his face in his father's side, his small body racked with tremors. He had been so excited about that milkshake. It was the highlight of his week. Now it was just a brown, sticky mess mingled with broken glass on the floor. "Oops," Rick sneered, the word dripping with false sincerity. He looked down at the mess his rage had created. "Clumsy me. Guess your freak show is over for today." He turned to his friends, expecting laughter, expecting validation. But even their weak bravado had faltered. They looked unnerved, their smirks replaced by expressions of discomfort. This had crossed a line even for them. The act of destroying a child's treat was so petty, so needlessly cruel, that it stripped away any pretense of righteous indignation. It was pure, pathetic bullying. The community of onlookers remained frozen, a gallery of fear-struck statues. Chloe the waitress had her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Mr. Henderson had vanished back into the kitchen. No one moved. No one spoke. Their silence was a form of complicity, a collective failure of courage that left Arthur and Leo utterly alone in their humiliation. The weight of their inaction was as heavy and oppressive as Rick's physical presence. Arthur felt his son shaking against him, and something inside him finally shifted. The cold, controlled fury began to burn hot. But it was not the kind of heat that led to fists. It was a clarifying fire, one that burned away everything but what mattered most. He held his son tighter for a moment, whispering unheard words into his hair. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace that defied the ugliness of the moment, he gently moved Leo aside and slid out of the booth. He did not rise to his full height. He did not confront Rick. Instead, he knelt. He knelt on the cold, dirty floor, amidst the scattered fries and the sticky, spreading puddle of milkshake and glass. His knees cracked, a quiet protest from a body that had seen too much wear. He began to pick up the larger shards of glass, his movements careful and precise, placing them gently on a napkin he had pulled from the dispenser. He was not just cleaning a mess. It was an act of profound, defiant dignity. He was refusing to let this man's ugliness be the final word. He was taking control of the situation not by escalating it, but by absorbing it, by literally kneeling down to meet it and clean it away. He was showing his son that you could not always control what others did, but you could always control how you responded. You could respond with grace. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the echoing silence of the diner. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to rise, to unleash the coiled serpent of his rage and wipe the smug, cruel smirk off Rick's face. But as he knelt on the cold floor, his fingers carefully navigating the treacherous landscape of shattered glass, he looked at his son. Leo was watching him, his tear-filled eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. In that gaze, Arthur saw his purpose. It was not to win a fight. It was to teach his son how to survive a wound. He finished picking up the largest, most dangerous pieces of glass. Then he looked up, not at Rick, but directly at Leo. He held his son's gaze, creating their private world once more in the midst of the wreckage. He lifted a hand, sticky with spilled milkshake, and signed with unshakable clarity. "It is okay. Accidents happen. We will clean it. We are helpers." It was a lesson he and Sarah had taught Leo from the time he was a toddler. When you see a mess, you help clean it. When you see someone who is hurt, you help them. It was a simple, foundational principle of their family. You meet chaos and cruelty not with more of the same, but with quiet acts of restoration. Leo's trembling began to subside, his expression shifting from terror to a dawning understanding. He watched his father, this quiet giant who was kneeling on the floor, and he saw not weakness, but a strength he could not yet name. Then Arthur did something that broke the heart of every person watching. He pushed himself slowly to his feet, his knees aching. He walked not to Rick, but to the counter where Chloe stood frozen. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. It was a worn leather thing, soft with age, it seems frayed. He opened it. Inside, there was a single folded $10 bill and a faded photograph of Sarah, laughing in the summer sun. It was the last of his cash until his disability check arrived on Friday. It was meant for gas, for a loaf of bread, for a small carton of milk. It was the margin between getting by and not. With a steady hand, he unfolded the bill and placed it on the counter. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet, raspy from disuse, but it carried in the silent room with the weight of thunder. "This should cover the glass," he said to Chloe. He pushed the money towards her. "And for the mess. I'm sorry for the trouble." He was apologizing. He, the victim, was taking responsibility. He was paying for the meal they would not get to eat, for the humiliation that had been forced upon them. It was an act of such profound, selfless dignity that it sent a shockwave through the room. It was not the act of a victim. It was the act of a man so thoroughly in command of his own soul that no external force could diminish it. He was demonstrating to his son, and to everyone else, that his honor was not something someone like Rick could take. It was his to give, and he would not surrender it. He would not be rattled. He would simply pay the price and endure. Rick stared, his mouth slightly agape. He was completely disarmed. He had expected shouting, pleading, fighting. He had never anticipated this quiet, devastating grace. It was a language he did not understand, a form of power against which his physical intimidation was utterly useless. He was left looking foolish, a playground bully who had just tried to intimidate a king. Arthur turned from the counter, his duty done. He walked back to his son, ready to guide him out of this place, his quiet victory complete. Just as Arthur reached for Leo's hand, a new sound intruded, a sound from the world outside the rain-streaked windows. It started as a low, almost imperceptible rumble, a vibration felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. It was a deep, guttural thrumming that seemed to rise up from the very asphalt of the road. Patrons, grateful for a distraction, turned their heads toward the windows, their brows furrowed. Rick and his friends, their moment of triumph utterly deflated, also looked, their expressions shifting from smugness to confusion. The rumble grew steadily, exponentially. It was not one engine, but many, a chorus of them, a symphony of internal combustion that spoke of raw, untamed power. The windows of the Starlight Diner began to vibrate in their frames. The sugar shakers on the tables danced. The sound swelled from a rumble to a roar, a ground-shaking thunder that drowned out the sound of the rain and the nervous coughs inside the diner. It was the sound of an approaching army, a wave of steel and noise that was about to break upon their small roadside world. Inside the diner, the atmosphere had already begun to shift. The spell of fear was breaking, fractured first by Arthur's quiet dignity and now by the impossible sound from outside. Chloe, the waitress, looked from the $10 bill on the counter to Arthur's back. The fear in her eyes was being replaced by a hot flush of shame, and beneath it, a powerful flicker of awe. She had seen cruelty before, but she had never seen it met with such profound grace. She felt an urge to snatch the money back, to tell him it wasn't his responsibility, but she was still frozen, a witness to a drama whose next act was thundering towards them. In a corner booth, an old man who had been silently watching the entire exchange over the rim of his coffee cup, a man who had seen his share of life's injustices, slowly lowered his mug. He met Arthur's eyes across the room. There was no pity in his gaze, only a deep, profound respect. He gave Arthur a single, slow, deliberate nod. It was a small gesture, but in the charged silence of the room, it was a seismic event. It was the first crack in the wall of communal inaction. It was a recognition. One person saw. One person understood. The thundering outside grew to a deafening crescendo, and then, one by one, the engines began to cut out, replaced by the squeal of brakes and the heavy crunch of tires on wet gravel. Headlights, dozens of them, sliced through the gray afternoon, flooding the diner's interior with an intense, interrogating light. Everyone inside was now on their feet, crowding the windows, their faces pressed against the cool glass. What they saw made them gasp. The parking lot, previously empty save for a few sedans and Arthur's beaten-up pickup truck, was now full. It was a sea of chrome and black leather, a phalanx of motorcycles parked in perfect, intimidating formation. Harley-Davidsons, mostly, their massive frames gleaming in the rain. And on these bikes or dismounting from them were men. Large men. Men clad in leather vests or cuts, adorned with patches that left no doubt as to who they were. A skull with wings. The words Hell's Angels stitched in bold, blood-red letters. They were not just a few bikers out for a ride. It was a legion. Dozens upon dozens of them, their numbers seeming to multiply in the misty rain. They moved with a quiet, disciplined purpose, a silent army assembling for battle. The diner door swung open with such force that it slammed against the interior wall, making the bell above it shriek. The man who filled the doorway was enormous, a mountain of a man with a beard the color of salt and pepper that flowed down over the front of his cut. His face was a roadmap of hard miles and harder fights, but his eyes, sharp and intelligent, held no malice. They held only a calm, unwavering focus. He scanned the room, his gaze passing over the terrified patrons, over the suddenly pale and trembling thugs, before finally landing and softening on Arthur and Leo. He stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under his weight, and behind him, another biker entered, and another, and another. They filed in not with the chaotic energy of a mob, but with the chilling silence of a disciplined unit. One by one, they filled the aisle, then the space by the counter, then the gaps between the tables. They were a rising tide of leather, denim, and steel, displacing the air, making the small diner feel claustrophobic and dangerously small. They did not speak. They did not have to. Their sheer presence was a statement, a physical manifestation of overwhelming power. The patrons flattened themselves against the walls and into their booths, trying to become invisible. Rick and his friends, who had minutes ago been the apex predators of this small ecosystem, now looked like cornered rats. They were pale, sweating, their eyes darting around at the silent, imposing figures that now surrounded them. There was no escape. Arthur stood frozen, his hand resting protectively on Leo's shoulder. He did not know these men. He had no idea why they were here. He could only watch as their numbers swelled, an impossible, terrifying flood. He counted 10, then 20, then 50. They kept coming, a seemingly endless river of them, until every square inch of the Starlight Diner was occupied. The final count was staggering, unbelievable. There had to be over 100 men packed into the small building. The air was thick with the smell of rain, damp leather, engine oil, and an unspoken promise of violence. And in the center of it all, the epicenter of this sudden, silent storm, stood Arthur and his son. The massive biker who had entered first, the man who was clearly their leader, navigated his way through the tightly packed crowd of his brethren. A path parted for him effortlessly. He moved with a heavy, deliberate gait, his boots making solid, confident sounds on the linoleum floor. He completely ignored Rick and his cronies, his eyes fixed only on Arthur and the small boy hiding behind him. He stopped a few feet away, his sheer size eclipsing the light from the window. Arthur instinctively pulled Leo closer, his body a shield. He braced himself, unsure of what was coming next. Was this another, more terrifying threat? Had they somehow stumbled from one nightmare into another? But the big man did not loom. He did not threaten. Instead, he did something that stunned the entire room into a deeper, more profound silence. He slowly, carefully lowered himself down onto one knee. The leather of his pants creaked in protest. He brought himself down to Leo's eye level, transforming his intimidating frame into something approachable, something safe. The gesture was one of profound respect, the kind a knight might show a king. He looked at Leo, his weathered face softening into a gentle, kind expression. He saw the boy's fear, the tear tracks on his cheeks. Then he raised one of his hands, a hand as large as a catcher's mitt, with knuckles that looked like they were carved from stone. The hand was calloused and scarred, but its movement was surprisingly gentle, almost delicate. Slowly, with a fluency that spoke of long and intimate practice, he signed. "Are you okay, little man?" Leo's eyes widened in astonishment. He looked from the man's signing hand to his father, and back again. In his entire life, outside of his parents and his teachers at the special school he attended, no one had ever signed to him. Especially not a stranger. Especially not a man who looked like he could wrestle a bear. He gave a small, hesitant nod. The biker leader smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. He then signed again. "My name is John, but my friends call me Preacher." "What's your name?" Leo, his fear melting away, replaced by a blossoming curiosity, shyly lifted his own small hands. "Leo." Preacher nodded. "It's a strong name, the name of a lion." He then looked up at Arthur, his gaze filled with a deep, knowing respect. "Arthur Morgan?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Arthur, dumbfounded, could only nod. Preacher rose slowly to his feet. "We served together. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Kandahar Province, 2011." He tapped a small, faded patch on his vest. "You were with Charlie Company. I was with Echo. We never met, but I knew your name. We all knew your name after that day. You pulled 3 men out of a burning Humvee under fire." The reveal landed with the force of a physical blow. Arthur, the quiet man, the janitor who knelt to clean a spilled milkshake, was a decorated war hero. The patrons of the diner stared at him with new eyes, seeing not a victim, but a man of immense, hidden courage. Preacher continued, his voice resonating with emotion. "My son, Michael, he was deaf. He was my whole world. He passed away 2 years ago." He paused, swallowing hard. "I'm on a veterans support forum online. I saw your post last week. You wrote about how much this Tuesday trip to the diner with your son meant to you. How it was the one thing that kept you grounded. A piece of normal." He gestured to the silent army of bikers behind him. "These are my brothers. From chapters all over the state. We decided to ride out here today. We were going to surprise you, buy you boys your lunch. Show some solidarity. We just got here a little late, it seems." We heard the end of it from outside. His eyes, hard as flint, shifted for the first time, landing on Rick. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. The weight of recognition settled over Arthur, so immense it almost buckled his knees. He was not alone. He had never been alone. A brotherhood he didn't even know he had was standing behind him. A silent legion that had answered a call he never made. Tears welled in his eyes, blurring the faces of the bikers into a wall of leather and loyalty. Preacher took a step forward, his massive frame a fortress between Arthur's family and the thugs. He stood directly in front of Rick, who now seemed to have shrunk, his face the color of ash. The biker leader didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His quiet words carried the unassailable weight of command. "You," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl, "are going to apologize to this boy. You will look him in the eye and you will tell him you are sorry for your ignorance and your cruelty." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Then you are going to get on your hands and knees, and you are going to clean every last bit of this mess from the floor. You will use your own shirt if you have to." Rick opened his mouth to protest, a flicker of his old bravado trying to reignite, but it was instantly extinguished by the cold, unwavering stare from Preacher and the almost imperceptible, collective shift of the 120 bikers surrounding him. It was a subtle movement, a tensing of muscles, a hardening of jaws, but it was a promise of swift and overwhelming consequences. Trembling, Rick nodded. He turned to Leo, his eyes darting around fearfully. I'm sorry, kid," he stammered, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. Preacher's voice was like ice. "Not good enough. Look at him." Rick forced his gaze to meet Leo's. "I'm sorry," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "Now," Preacher commanded, pointing a thick finger at the floor. "Clean." Without another word, Rick and his two friends dropped to their knees. The humiliation was total, a perfect, symmetrical reversal of the indignity they had inflicted on Arthur. They began to sop up the spilled milkshake with handfuls of napkins, picking out the shards of glass with trembling fingers. The diner patrons watched this act of forced penance in stunned silence. Justice, it turned out, did not always come from a courtroom. Sometimes it rode in on two wheels. While the thugs cleaned, Preacher turned to the counter. He pulled a thick roll of cash from his pocket and slapped it down, the sound echoing in the room. It was a huge sum, far more than enough to cover a lifetime of meals. "Mr. Henderson," he called out, his voice booming. The diner owner scurried out from the kitchen, his face pale. "From this day forward, Arthur and Leo Morgan eat here for free, for as long as they want. This is their table. You understand?" Mr. Henderson could only nod, his eyes wide as saucers. Preacher then turned back to Leo. He reached up to his own vest, to a spot over his heart. With careful fingers, he undid the stitching of a small, unique patch. It was an image of a human ear with a single, elegant wing extending from it. He knelt down once more and gently pressed the patch into Leo's small hand. He signed, "This is for you, little lion. It means you have brothers who are always listening for you, even if you cannot hear them. It means you are under our protection. Always." Leo looked down at the patch, then up at the giant, gentle man, and then at his father. He threw his arms around Arthur's waist, burying his face in his side, his small body finally releasing the last of its tension. Arthur wrapped his arms around his son, holding him tight, his heart overflowing with a gratitude so immense it left him breathless. He had tried to be a wall for his son, only to find an entire army had risen up to stand with him. The thugs finished their work, the floor now immaculately clean. Preacher gestured to the door with his chin. "Get out, and don't ever let me see your faces in this town again." The three men scrambled to their feet and practically ran from the diner, disappearing into the gray, misty rain like the phantoms they were. Path cleared. The sea of bikers parted, creating a wide, respectful aisle from booth number 7 to the front door. It was a corridor of honor. Preacher placed a heavy, comforting hand on Arthur's shoulder. "Time to go home, brother," he said softly. Arthur nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He took Leo's hand and began to walk. As they passed through the ranks of the bikers, every single man, from the grizzled veterans to the younger prospects, met his eyes and gave a slow, deliberate nod of respect. It was a salute, a silent acknowledgement of his courage, his fatherhood, his sacrifice. The patrons of the diner, who had earlier been silent witnesses, were now all on their feet. They began to clap. It started with one person, then another, until the entire diner was filled with a thunderous, heartfelt applause. They were not just clapping for the spectacle. They were clapping to atone for their own silence, to celebrate the quiet dignity that had triumphed over loud-mouthed cruelty. As Arthur and Leo stepped outside, the rain had finally stopped. The clouds were beginning to break, and a few weak, watery shafts of sunlight were piercing through the gray overcast, making the wet chrome of the motorcycles glitter like a field of diamonds. The air smelled clean, washed new. Arthur led Leo to their old, dented pickup truck, a humble vehicle that suddenly seemed like a king's chariot. He buckled his son into the passenger seat. Leo was holding the winged ear patch in his hand, tracing its stitched edges with his finger, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated awe. He looked at his father, his eyes shining with a love and admiration so profound it was a physical force. His world was safe. His father was his hero. Arthur closed the door and walked around to the driver's side, his movements feeling strangely light, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He got in, put the key in the ignition and turned it. The old engine coughed to life. As he prepared to pull out of the parking lot, Preacher gave him one last nod. Then, a signal was given, unseen and unheard, and in perfect, deafening unison, 120 motorcycle engines roared to life. The sound was not a threat. It was a salute. It was the roar of 120 iron lions, a concussive blast of respect and solidarity that shook the very foundations of the diner. It was a promise, a vow, a declaration to the entire world that this quiet man and his son were not alone. They were protected. They were family. As Arthur pulled his truck onto the road, the thunder of the engines followed them, a guardian escort for the first 100 yards of their journey home. He looked in his rearview mirror and saw the sea of bikers, a brotherhood of improbable angels, watching them go. He then looked at his son. Leo held up the patch, then pointed to his own heart, then to his father. "My hero." Arthur smiled, a real, deep smile that reached his soul. He had faced down the ugliness of the world and had not flinched. He had kept his promise to his wife. And in doing so, he had shown his son that the quietest heart can command the respect of thunder.